Yeah, that's lottery moms, right?
Yeah.
No, I haven't, but I tutored 4 people in it already this year.
I need to.
Switch between.
Is it, it's a probability part?
Yeah, well, no, it's the combination. It's like the combination is equal to the permutation, right, which is like n factor divided by n minus p factor divided by something. That whole thing.
When you're working with factorials, the best thing to remember is there's up until the point.
Correct. But then it's like you have a combination.
All right, let's get started. Welcome back and happy Friday. Sounds like we've got some exciting stuff happening, whether it's between like auditions, parts, or upcoming performances, or exams, or fun assignments coming up. So I know we're starting to get busy. Weather's getting better, getting into springtime. So exciting time to be here. So we'll use some time today to go over some signups for the class presentation you'll be doing later in the term, and then we'll be getting into social exchange theory, or SET, that will continue to explore some of the things we've been building on with interpersonal communication theory. So to recap, we talked about URT, uncertainty reduction theory. We talked about the idea of catfishing, right? Spying on behavior online, presenting like a false version of yourself, and applied URT to examining those issues. Get a chance to get to know somebody else in the class and learn how you all reduce uncertainty through communication. URT is axiomatic, right? It has laws or rules. One of them being the idea that high levels of certainty produce blank reciprocity, while low uncertainty produces blank reciprocity. Anybody want to take a stab at this? Yeah.
Higher or lower.
Yes. So remind me again, what is reciprocity? Yeah. Yeah.
Is there reciprocation of that?
Yeah. So Daniel and Jessica, both good points, right? The idea here is that you can think about reciprocity like shaking your hand and having them shake your hand, or like a seesaw, right? It's that our communication is very one-to-one. In other words, when we don't know people very well, it's very back and forth. How are you today? Good. How are you? Good. How are you? Right? Like it's very, one person is not occupying that much more time speaking than the other person. But as we get to know people better and we're more comfortable, communication gets more one-sided. We're more willing to like vent to a friend, and then the next week they vent to us. Yeah.
It's like the conversation is all surface level because you can't really get into like deeper topics until you really have like a basis of what the person is and what they stand for, what they.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, right? It's this idea that we oftentimes are really cautious about getting into too much detail or oversharing, right? Because we really want to make the other person feel comfortable and establish that level of safety. We'll talk about that even more next week when we talk about social penetration theory, which gets similar ideas of how we convey comfort to other people. So for today, I want to take a moment to talk about the class presentation form. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to do like a big scary presentation like on Monday or anything like that. I just like to use early in the term the opportunity for you to share any times that you would prefer to present. That way we can develop a schedule that works for everybody and makes you share at a time that you feel comfortable. So right before class, I shared a Google form. I'm also going to pull it up for you. And I'm going to ask that you complete it by class time on Monday. That way we can start to figure out the overall schedule there. So if you go to the front page of Canvas, also if you check the announcements, it should be listed here as an announcement. It says discussion leading form. And then if you click here, you can access that form. So just indicate your name. I have listed out all of the days in the class that we're covering different theories. So what you can start by doing is just checking off the days that you know that you can't come to class. If that changes, for instance, if you were scheduled for a day and you ended up being sick, or like you got to go to nationals or something like that, that's okay. We'll work around it. But I'd just like to get a rough idea of your own schedule so that I'm not booking any times that people can't meet. So check off the times that you can't meet. And then I want to give you the option, if you have strong preferences about theories that you would like to talk about in the class. For instance, maybe you're really interested in this idea of the narrative paradigm, really like the way that we use stories and tell stories to communicate and persuade each other. Awesome. If you're not really sure about like your preference, one thing that you can do is just to take a look at, just a quick brush over that chapter or theory that you find interesting and you want to get into in a little bit more detail. But if you have no preference, you don't care, slot me for whatever, as long as it's a time I can meet, that's fine. You can indicate that too. But if you do have a preference, I want to give you that opportunity to indicate that preference with me. Once I get that from you all on Monday, I'll go ahead and post the rubric and then some of the more nitty-gritty expectations for this presentation. This is not supposed to be like a big, frightening presentation where you do a ton of research and preparation in advance. I want you to think about this as less formal and a lot more conversational in how we approach and think about theory, right? So this presentation is listed here on the syllabus. What I'm asking you to do is just 4 to 6 minutes, and I'd like you to answer the question, why does this theory matter to our lives, right? As we talked about in the class, theory are tools for living. We've already talked about how things like uncertainty reduction theory and symbolic interaction theory are used to communicate and relate to one another. And you might think about why we should care about the theory that you've been assigned, right? I'm not asking you to do like a book report or chapter report on the theory, right? You don't have to define and work through the theory like I might be doing later in the class. That's not the goal here. Instead, I'm asking you to draw maybe from your own experience or examples in the world, such as media, current events, or other issues, to show us why this theory is relevant and matters to us outside of us talking about that in the classroom. You can use slides, short video clips, as long as the video clip is just like a minute or so. If you'd like to use poetry, performance, whatever, like as a creative expression to do so, you're welcome to do that too. And the things that I'd be looking at and grading are your preparation. Is this a presentation you put time and effort into preparing for? Are you using your time, that 4 to 6 minutes, appropriately? Are you showing that you understand and have good knowledge of that theory in question, right? I am asking you prior to your presentation date to indicate an outline to me that just shows me the things that you'll be covering in your presentation. And again, I will not likely start blocking out presentations until week 4 to ensure that people have plenty of time from when they know they're scheduled to present to when their presentation is actually due. So not coming up right around the corner, but I did want to give you a sense of what to expect once people indicate their preferences and we can get the schedule together. So knowing that that's coming up, does anybody have any questions regarding that assignment? It'll be a nice way to break things up. For instance, we'll probably have like, 2 or 3 people presenting a week, maybe more. We might have multiple people presenting on the same day, and each person would allow their own perspective on that theory to shine through. Yeah. Is there any other questions? I saw a hand up here. Okay, we're good.
I had a hand, but then I read, I was
Gotcha.
gonna ask how long it was.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, and then like before, I'll do that grid style rubric and I'll post that next week. Again, this is not a public speaking class. I'm not asking you to be, an incredibly flawless presenter, or I'm not grading you on your speaking ability. Instead, that you're presenting and sharing and answering that problem in a way that's interesting and unique to the course. So for today, we talked a little bit about that. What I want to get into is social exchange theory, or SET, and we'll apply that to thinking about our human relationships. One thing that we'll be doing for today that's a little bit different is giving you the opportunity to critique this theory. So as we're working through this today, I really want you to pay attention to what about this theory makes sense to you and is persuasive, and what you might push back against on this one, because it's a little bit more of a controversial theory. You might not all be on the same page, and part of this process is about us understanding what about a theory does or doesn't ring true. Like I said before, bad reality TV is a really great way to apply and use theory. you know, it's just increasingly dire when I watch like what new reality shows are on Netflix because it just feels more and more like manipulative. There's a new TV show out on Netflix where there's like an ultimatum about whether or not people should be engaged, and they go on the show and they date somebody else to figure out if they're actually going to get engaged to their original partner. Like some of that stuff just gets gross and weird. But unfortunately, reality TV is a really great example of communication theory in action because it looks at a lot of the drama and dynamics of human relationships. And a really good example of this, and again, of my like increasing descent in quality of programming I watched during COVID is in the whole Bachelor/Bachelorette franchise, right? Which, if you have seen it before, right, the premise is that there is a lead, right, and that lead has a variety of people that are single, although some of them pretend to be single on the show and actually have somebody back home, right? The premise is that there is a single person who's out seeking a partner, and over the course of the show, they gradually eliminate people until they find the person that they might propose to or end up with together, right? So that's sort of how the show is supposed to unfold. Of course, there's a lot of drama. It's a reality show, so not a lot of it is very real, and it doesn't play out super well in a lot of situations. But I think that the core premise of these and a lot of other reality TV shows that suggest that we're like eliminating possible partners or people to start dating or being involved with as the show progresses and as people on the show are evaluating their relationships is a good way to think about social exchange theory, right? Because the core of this theory is the idea that we are thinking about in choosing the relationships that we are involved in our lives in terms of worth, right? Costs and benefits, and ultimately making a calculation about the relationships that we see as good to include and continue to have in our lives, right? And that entire premise for some people can cause some pushback, especially if we think about things like family relationships or close friend relationships, right? There's a lot of debate. For instance, some people who say, you know, in terms of family relationships, there might be healthy situations to break away from those relationships that are not beneficial, and culturally, people that might choose to retain certain relationships no matter what, right? So already there's some questions about how we approach our human relationships. But this idea of what is a relationship worth is this guiding principle here, right? If we think about our friendships, or we might use the phrase chosen family, we pick people that we enjoy having in our lives, who we believe are a net positive in our lives, right? Not to say that in a relationship there aren't ups and downs or problems in a relationship, because there are, but that overall, when we're assessing a relationship, that we choose to continue relationships that add on to what we already experience. That there's something that both of us get out of those relationships better than being alone. So this is socio-psychological, like last time, looking at the underlying psychological motivators, what guides us to make decisions about our relationships. Again, it takes an intra and interpersonal approach because it's looking at relationships primarily between two people. And again, it's positivistic and empirical because it develops certain theories that assume sort of objectively, this is how we make decisions about relationships, right? So SET comes from John Theobald and Harold Kelly. Both are social psychologists and come from a social psychologist background and are really concerned with how we make decisions, also drawing from the idea of game theory. How many people have taken like a course in economics or a course that talked about the idea of game theory at all? Few of you, right? So these types of approaches, if you've taken an econ class before, right? Econ is about understanding human behavior and about sort of trying to map out why we act the way we do and make decisions the way that we do. Whether it's at a very micro level, making decisions on what to purchase or how to work our jobs, or whether it's a much more macro level about how we manage things like the federal budget. So in mathematical terms then, SET has an equation, right, that guides our relationships. That worth, the overall worth of the relationship, is equal to rewards minus costs. In other words, the worth is this overall net beneficial, does this relationship add more to our lives, or does this track to or hurt our lives, right? And we think about this in terms of the positive value associated with rewards. For instance, one reward in a relationship might be the ability to laugh and feel like you can have fun. One reward might be that you feel like you can vent advice for somebody to lean on, right? Those are all things that we might see as benefits, whether it's to a friendship, a romantic relationship, a family relationship, and so on. But costs, right, are the negative value that we associate with relationships. In other words, for instance, cost might be that a relationship might be incredibly toxic or negative or draining. You might find yourself getting personal attacks or name calling, right? Maybe it's economically draining. Like you have a friend that's relying on you for support or a place to stay, and you're worried about the way that they are managing resources as they stay in your home, right? So the outcome then is whether or not people choose to continue a relationship based on that calculation, right? And this is not to say that in every situation, if somebody says, oh, the costs are worth more than the rewards, that the relationship will end. Instead, if cost is a big factor, right, then we might question or reevaluate the relationship and why we choose to have that relationship in our lives, right? So that uses, again, this like marketplace metaphor. If you think about something like the stock market, right, you're choosing to invest in stocks among the stocks that are available, right? The stocks rise and fall in the same way that our relationships could get stronger and positive, or relationships could really fall by the wayside and not work out so well, right? For instance, growing up, I had close friends in high school, but maybe some of my friends and I went in very different directions. And as a result of that, we no longer felt like it was a good idea to continue that relationship because of how different we were later, right? So there are some central assumptions, and when you're critiquing or thinking about if a theory is persuasive, one really good way to do that is just to look at those central assumptions and beliefs and determine for yourself whether or not you find these to be persuasive. The first one is the idea that our relationships are ultimately guided by self-interest, that at the end of the day, we choose to be in relationships with other people because there is something that we see for ourselves. Maybe we enjoy being kind or putting ourselves out there for other people, but the idea that there is something that we gain through that process is a really important factor in how we do relationships. Another idea here is the idea that people think rationally. That's not to say that people are in their heads every single time when they're having a chat with one of their friends saying, okay, is your worth good? Is, are your costs outweighing your benefits? Like, we don't do that, but we are thinking about the concerns that we have in our relationships and whether or not those might be, for example, deal breakers. And that people create and maintain our relationships towards self-interest. For instance, if we think about the process of socialization and developing a lot of the core relationships or network or community in our lives, right? We're thinking about those things as a safety net for us in addition to that other person. So those assumptions about being guided by self-interest and our ability to make calculations about our relationships and if our relationships are worth it are important guiding principles here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these different parts or dimensions of this theory. One of them being this idea of interdependence, another being a look at the relationship and the idea of power and exchange that comes up in those relationships. So you can think about it kind of like a keystone, right? It holds a bunch of rocks together. This idea of interdependence means that ultimately, if there's what you bring to the table in a friendship, what they bring to the table in a friendship, that what's ultimately keeping it together is the emergence of those things that create a beneficial situation. If you've ever heard the phrase, more than the sum of its parts, right? Oftentimes we feel that in our friendships and relationships. One of the ideas here is that there's mutual dependence, right? That we are relying on people for particular tasks. For example, if you have a roommate and you're dividing up some of the tasks that you do, maybe they're in charge of the dishes and you're in charge of dusting and cleaning surfaces. That might be a way that you divide up tasks and ensure that you all are able to support each other. Another concern here in interdependence is that of power, right? Power is the ability to control and influence other people. So it's important for us to think about how power might impact our relationships. If, for instance, it's a relationship between a landlord and a tenant, there, of course, are going to be power dynamics. The tenant is, of course, motivated to have a positive relationship and show, hey, I'm being good at my job and cleaning this place up. The landlord is concerned with ensuring that what they're offering to the tenant is affordable and well maintained. Conflict is another concern, right? When we are interdependent and close to each other, we experience conflict. If you've taken conflict management before, we know that conflict is not inherently a bad thing. In fact, conflict can be a force for good if it lets us better understand each other when we get out of it. But conflict can definitely happen when we find ourselves competing or running into issues, including with proximity. One example that's interesting is that a lot of romantic couples who had to be together a lot more under COVID-19 started to develop a lot more tension. There's a lot of jokes about how people, when they started taking meetings from home, learned a lot more about each other. Somebody joked that they didn't realize that my partner was a, let's circle back to this type of person in their meetings, but I discovered that when we had to take them on Zoom. Coordination is another important idea, right? The idea that you and another person are working together and figuring out solutions together. Sometimes if you're not sharing the same goals, that can be an issue. Future interdependence is another concern. A lot of times in our relationships, we're thinking about our future. What does that look like? In fact, a lot of romantic relationships might fall apart when we see that maybe how we envision the future together looks different, right? Somebody wants to move forward to marriage or children and the other person doesn't. That can be a source of tension. And then relational certainty is knowing where you and the other person stand, right? The idea that you understand what that relationship looks like, setting appropriate boundaries, how often you spend time with that person, and so on. So if somebody breaches those boundaries and says, hey, you're just starting to get to know me as a friend, you're sharing more than I want to know, right? That could be an issue of relational certainty. So another idea here is evaluating the relationship, right? How many people have heard of the prisoner's dilemma? A couple of you. So I wanted to share a video clip that talks about the prisoner's dilemma because I think it's a useful way of thinking about sort of the guiding human behavior surrounding some of the evaluation of our human relationships. So as you're watching, think about how this theory helps us to understand the decisions we might make in continuing or not continuing a relationship that we might be involved in. So go ahead and share that video clip.
Let's say Mr. Blue and Miss Red have each been arrested for some minor crime. The police think they committed a more serious crime, but they don't have enough evidence to convict them. They need a confession. They take them and put them in separate rooms so they can't talk and play a little game. To try to force a confession, the police give them each a choice. Admit your partner committed the crime and you'll go free. We'll pardon you for the minor crime, but your partner will have to spend 3 years in prison. If you stay silent and your partner lets us know that you were the one who really did it, then you're going to have to go away for 3 years. They know that the police don't have any evidence, and if they both stay silent, then they will only go to prison 1 year each for the minor crime. If they both betray each other, then they'll both go to prison for 2 years each. Okay, each partner can do one of two things: stay silent or betray. Staying silent would be cooperating and betraying would be defecting. If they both stay silent, then they each spend a year in prison. If one betrays and the other stays silent, then the betrayer goes free and the silent spends 3 years in prison. If they both betray, then it's 2 years each. So what are they going to do? Well, they should cooperate. That's the best option for the group if we add the total number of years in prison. But let's take it from Red's perspective. If she thinks Blue is going to stay silent, then she should betray so she can go free. Going free is better than spending a year in prison. If she thinks he's going to betray her, then she should definitely betray. 2 years in jail is better than 3 and being made a fool of. Blue is in the exact same situation and will think the exact same thing. He should betray if she stays silent, and he should betray if she betrays. They should have both cooperated, but from an individual standpoint, they notice they could always gain by defecting if they have no control over what the other person's going to do. So they'll both defect to try to better their own situation, but come away not only hurting the group, but themselves. Individually, they're worse off than if they both cooperated. This situation is pretty made up, but it has some real world analogs. A common example is with marketing. Let's say 2 cigarette companies, Red Stripes and Smooth Blue, are deciding how much money they should spend on advertising. Since the product they each make is identical to one another, advertising has a huge impact on sales. For simplicity, let's say their choices are to advertise a bunch or not advertise at all. And there's just 100 people in the society and they all smoke. If both don't advertise, then just by random chance picking cigarette boxes, 50 people buy Red Strikes and 50 people buy Smooth Blue. At $2 a pack, they each made $100. Let's say advertising costs $30. If one person advertises and the other does not, then 80 people will buy the cigarettes from the ads and 20 people buy the other ones. The advertiser makes $160 minus $30 for ads and comes away with $130. The non-advertiser didn't spend any money, but only made $40. If they both advertise, again, half will buy Red Strikes and half will buy Smooth Blue. But since they both spent $30 on advertising, they only come away with $70 each.
So kind of an example, an application of this idea, right? If we think about it in terms of economic relationships, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense that the overall costs, for instance, of advertising, if both people do it, would be more than if neither did it in that scenario. But I think this is a useful way of thinking about and exploring human relationships under social exchange theory, right? Again, getting at this idea that oftentimes in our relationships, trust is this foundational component, that if we feel mutual trust, we have this optimal outcome, right? That we can rely on somebody, they can rely on us, and we both gain from that relationship. If we both choose to end the relationship and it's, you know, a friendship that is not worth continuing, then that's a good option for us too. But sometimes we're motivated toward relationships that might be one-sided, that benefit us, but don't carry the same degree of benefit to the other person, right? Or we might choose to exit a relationship that's not beneficial to us, but beneficial to the other person because we see other opportunities available for us. Grass is greener on the other side, right? So in other words, we're making comparison levels. The first comparison level is whether or not we see this relationship as better or worse than nothing, right? So maybe you have a friend, but you find that that friend has been kind of making fun of you or is always asking you for money, but never giving it back, and you feel like they are kind of using you, right? You might choose to make the decision to end the relationship because you think that it's not mutually beneficial. The other option is the comparison level for alternatives. That is, you assess the relationship compared to the other possible relationships that you might have. For instance, again, on shows like The Bachelor or Bachelorette, they're dating multiple people at the same time. They get to make a decision where they look at how far along one relationship has gone relative to another relationship and say, hey, I don't think this is working out with us. I feel more connected to this person. So this whole idea of the prisoner's dilemma, it's the most strategic for people to trust each other, right? And to both stay silent. They have the best outcome if they stay silent, but it's the most beneficial for you if you rat out the other person, but both people know that, and that creates trust issues, can demonstrate a lot of the problems we see in how we make decisions about relationships and whether or not we really develop that mutual trust, right? If you've ever watched movies like in the MCU, right? Loki is a prime example of a character who's like constantly betraying everybody to get what he wants. So we think about how social exchange theory is dealing with concerns about making individually beneficial or self-interested choices compared to a mutually beneficial choice for two people. Additionally, as part of this, right, one of the ways that we might try to navigate our relationships and navigate the costs and work we see is by evaluating behavior. So one idea here is this idea of fate outcome, where we're trying to control the behavior of somebody else in a relationship. We're basically trying to cover the fate or the outcome that we hope to see in that relationship. One good example of this is like using like hinting or passive aggressive statements. For example, saying, wow, that was a really long drive. I really, spent a long time driving you over here, right? Trying to get the other person to like thank you or apologize for the amount of time you spent driving. So in situations like that, we try to control or moderate how somebody else behaves to make the relationship more beneficial to us. And that might be not a great thing or kind of manipulative, but social exchange theory suggests it's a way that we might choose to make a relationship that doesn't feel worthwhile feel more worthwhile. Meanwhile, behavioral control is about you changing your own behavior in order to impact the relationship as a whole, right? And again, there's a lot of examples in shows like The Bachelor, Bachelorette, where the main character, person on the show, person character, same difference, is basically self-disclosing and sharing things about themselves. It's been really hard for me. I'm really trying to open up and get to know everybody, right? And by the process of sharing their own vulnerability or challenges, they hope that other people will open up and create valuable relationships with them, right? So the idea here is that by changing our behavior, we can maybe make the relationship feel more meaningful. And again, that might relate really closely to our levels of self-disclosure. Additionally, there's this idea, right, of matrices or matrices that we use for how we evaluate relationships. We might look at the outcomes available. For instance, we might say, okay, overall, we see this relationship as a net positive. It helps us develop a closer connection. The effective matrix is examining our relationship compared to alternatives. For instance, if you choose to take a relationship that is platonic and make it a more romantic relationship, or move back from that, right? That would be an example of changing the outcome of the relationship. And a dispositional matrix deals with the idea of how rewards ought to be exchanged. So for instance, maybe you and a friend are having a little bit of a complicated relationship and you say, hey, I really want to help you out. I know you're going through a difficult time. Would you be willing to pay some of the rent that you've missed by this date, right? So we're making these kind of evaluations over the course of our relationships too. So again, to think about sort of an application and usage here in terms of TV shows like Bachelor and Bachelorette, right? There's this concern about how, when there's like 28 to 30 single people that are dating this one person, that the lead in the show is trying to make a decision about who they're ultimately choosing to be with and which relationship they're continuing. A lot of the drama on these shows are about how these people are trying to decide who to keep, who to send home, what relationships they feel are stronger than others, what relationships have a future, whether or not the people that they're dating on these shows seem like they're ready for an engagement or to move forward in the relationship. And you can tell I clearly watched way too much of that during COVID. But kind of distressingly, there was a case in this latest season of The Bachelor where the main lead of that season shared that he was in love with 3 different people at the same time, which is in a lot of consensual and non-monogamous situations, something that might be consensual and fine, but clearly was an issue in the context of the show. And I think as an example of this attempt at making calculations using social exchange theory to ultimately determine the relationships that were considered to be the best.
There was a boy from Missouri that just wants to find love, and I can't wait to get married and have kids.
Crazy.
I believe more than anything that my future wife is going phenomenal at this point.
Looking for a wife, he's looking for long-term, he's also genuine, he's looking for you. This is the man I'm gonna spend my life with.
How much luckier can one man get? I know the one thing. I know she is.
Literally have everything I'm looking for.
They all look perfect in all ways.
Everything I'm looking for, social exchange.
Exactly what I've asked for.
I didn't believe it could happen, but I'm in love with freedom. I couldn't be more sure of that and fall in love with you.
I'm so excited for what's to come.
I'm falling in love with you. I'm in love with you. I just want you to know that what I'm about to say is not going to be here. I want to be fully transparent. I know it's not easy to hear, but I was intimate with both of you.
Been like this before.
To be fair, this is the trailer from like the very beginning of the season, so it's not a spoiler.
I'm so hungry.
So we can read as much as we want into the like manufactured, like fake entertaining elements of all of that, right? But one of the things that I do find interesting is that there's like multiple people that he says that he's in love with and he can't decide who it is, right? And that shows some of the boundaries and limits that we have in social exchange, right? It's not this easy, this person is more valuable than this person. But this idea that, you know, oftentimes our relationships are made really complicated by navigating the feelings that we have for different people and how to navigate all that stuff. So again, very kind of silly case, but we do make these kind of calculations all the time, whether it's deciding between multiple people with friendships, relationships that we continue or not continue, or perhaps less controversially, how we navigate the boundaries of our relationships. Do we have friends we talk to all the time, but we've drifted away from, or do we have friendships that we've really formed that are close or meaningful to us in our time since coming here to EOU? So those are some of the things guiding this theoretical approach. What I want to do now then is, given the things that we've laid out in defining and thinking about this theory, I'm going to break you off into some smaller groups. And what I want each group to talk about, and I'll have one person write or type the names of group members for attendance today, is as a group, do you find social exchange theory in the way that we've talked about it persuasive? Why or why not? Again, there's not necessarily a more or less correct answer. I'm looking for your perspective here. What is one critique that your group might have regarding this theory? And what do you consider to be useful about this theory, especially thinking about it in the context of our interpersonal and one-on-one communications? So looks like we got 12. So let's do 3 groups of 4. And then Maddie, I'm just going to ask you to think about this a little bit on your own. You're welcome to use the chat or share with us with audio after that. So let's go ahead and do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4. So take some time, talk amongst your group, and have one person write or type and be prepared to share your thoughts related to this group.
We're just right around one. Who wants to write?
My handwriting's awful, so probably not.
Not my favorite, but I think I'm just a good group. We will.
But no one really I- why?
My last name is.
So you find it. In more situations, I would say,
Not
Yes.
but in other situations.
You were?
Like,
Right.
or. You don't get anything.
Here.
In a very general sense.
Is the age calculated?
You're like a body. Is that gonna be good with that?
Okay.
Okay.
Like, even in a work environment, like in a professional.
And you kind of social exchange to your
It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it works.
Like
ultimately in the like
I see. I don't know. Binary, so it's binary of
Yeah.
positive and negative. I don't.
Yeah.
That's a good line, right? Like a lot of the way we look at relationships, it's not this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. It doesn't fit in that binary way of thinking.
Well.
I also have different letters. You guys are seeing both sides of who was good. And it was always like this and vice versa. And for a long time, I really thought that I was the problem.
Makes sense, but not in every relationship.
I didn't do that. I was going, but that was like, well, I wasn't the best. So how did I fail?
Did you either-
And I thought, how did I not like, I was just like, that whole word of like, words was hard. It really felt like, out of sight, like, a lot of words, my rewards, and it just really wasn't working, but I wanted to make it work. Because I really did not want to divorce, and I really thought it was. I like looking at it both sides, like for the people, like them as a person, you as a person.
What is your group's verdict so far?
So I think the person
Just
says,
saying
I
it's-
spend a lot, but I agree with there's some things that I'm like, oh, I'm not sure about.
It's like when you reflect and look back at a lot of relationships, it might add up or make sense.
You wouldn't go around every single relationship with that in mind. Relationship. You're upfront. Yeah, information. Yeah. Or like, what you have to force to you, but it-
Situational, or there's examples of people that you see in their life that you're like, ah, I don't.
How are you all feeling about this theory? This theory?
Pretty good. I understand.
Oh, yeah. Does seem a little bit like hesitation. Do you like it? Where do you kind of feel about it? How persuasive is it? Yeah.
Because I feel like there's relationships that people have that they aren't beneficial at all, but it could be a one-sided thing, but they do really right.
Yeah.
There's so much greater.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the challenges, right? There's like a lot of reasons that people might or might not choose to leave in those situations.
It's very limited.
I don't think
Right
we're
now,
having,
we got one member saying,
like, me trying to create a relationship.
issues and something about this.
I'm at school,
Okay.
and I
there
meet
should be,
people,
like,
there's nothing to be gained from this person right now, there's just like an interaction.
Statement made.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna separate a friendship.
At this point.
Yeah.
What do we do here?
That goes back, I mean, to uncertainty reduction theory, right? And the critique that
With somebody.
our desire to get to know or because of uncertainty has to be tied to a feeling that that
So it
relationship
helps
has
like that.
eventually. Right. Yeah.
No.
We're just very different people.
Yeah.
There's nothing in common. Like, it's just some personality clashes.
Sure. Yeah, it's like, or like that, I have like random extended family, like a cousin or something, like, we'll go over and visit and just it's like off lane money.
Well, I would say like the conclusion
I'm
or
gonna say
how
it's
to
very
balance
much-
the
Yeah.
Why would I initiate that much? It's a decision we have. to
Yes,
make.
that-
As long as we have big family events.
Yeah,
Especially like that, close together.
yeah,
We're still interacting.
yeah. Larry. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, our critique is that we're always-
So I'll give you all about 3 more minutes to chat and I'll ask each group to share.
It's hard to evaluate your own.
No,
Yeah. Like, it's hard to take care of.
Sometimes I can move through them right now. Okay, but someone.
Just you staying along.
No.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know, I don't know, I feel like Adam and I did not work on ourselves enough to know who we really were before we got married. But then we were married and we were trying to figure out ourselves and figure out how to be married at the same time. And so if you really don't know who you are, what you need and your wants and everything, you can't go and find that in someone else who will also benefit and will benefit from your relationship and also benefit from themselves. You know, I'm older than that. By a few months.
I By a few months? Oh, well, okay, I was initially freaked out, like, how do you know, but then I just shared my birthday. I did.
Which,
Forgot about
your
that.
birthday's in March,
Yeah.
correct?
It is, my
March
sister and I,
1992, November 1991.
my sister and I share the same birthday, 17 years apart.
Okay.
So that's kind of fun. All right, go ahead and wrap up.
That's fair. I was there. Anyway,
So I'm going to ask each of these three groups to share how they address these questions. I think we have Maddie in the chat as well. So Maddie, is there anything you would like to add in terms of your thoughts on this theory or what stood out to you? If you have thoughts later, we'll come back to you. So why don't we start here with the group on this side? So what did you all have to share? Oh, sorry.
So we said it is persuasive and a lot of what we do like focuses on our state, and it, for the second one, it doesn't like apply to many situations. And for number 3, we said that it's useful because you're able to like determine like what you want and you have control over your own.
Yeah. So one way of thinking about SET is thinking about what do I want out of a relationship? What am I looking for? And it provides you with a framework to figure out the important things to you and what your boundaries might look like. I like the idea too that it doesn't necessarily apply to every relationship. I was talking to the group here on this side and they were mentioning, you know, I don't have the same incentive to get to know people if they're just a stranger I'm not going to see again, right? So sometimes we're not making that calculation or putting in that level of effort in every relationship. So it's at times a useful way of thinking about our boundaries and limits and what we need out of relationships, but not always something that we would use. How about the group here in the middle?
I guess I'll talk. Okay.
Sure.
So we had a lot of mixed reviews.
Uh-huh.
Logan doesn't see the positive negative binary thinking of it. Maybe somewhere in the middle. Ryan and I, we think it's persuasive.
Mhm.
One critique that we made about it regarding this theory is that we really feel that it's situational versus like seeing examples of others, you know, and there's more than one variable that is within relationships. There's more gray in a relationship, we feel, and this is very cut black and white. With the whole cost, you know, the rewards measure cost equals the rewards. But we think it helps with rational thinking if you're deciding to come to the conclusion of the relationship, whether it's toxic or it's just really not working out for yourself or for the other person, or how to rebound from that.
Sure. I really like the way that your group kind of addressed your mixed perspectives here, right? The idea that it can be useful in navigating issues of conflict, but also the idea, as you all brought up, that oftentimes this sort of is it a good or a bad thing, is the positive, negative, that kind of binary way of thinking doesn't always work. For instance, we might enjoy relationships because they bring out specific parts of us, or they allow us to share or show versions of ourselves that we don't see in a different relationship. But it's not a good or bad, it's an apples to orange. The way that you talk around like a parent is really different than talking to a close friend. And maybe both of those things are good, but is like code switching, very different language and way of talking about different people. So good examples here. And then how about here on this side?
For which question?
How do you all overall approach these questions?
All of them. That's the answer, yeah. All of them.
Okay, so we said for the first one, in a business type relationship or a common goal would make sense, but more like personal or emotional relationships doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah.
And then we said sometimes there's no benefit to a relationship, but people will still maintain those relationships, which is obviously an outlier from what it's proposing. And then we said what's useful about it is it helps explain like company romantic and goal-related relationships.
Yeah. So thanks, Gavin. I really like the way that your group is kind of applying it to situation or context, because I think there's a lot of settings where like in organizational or business context, this makes a lot more sense. It's like you're deciding who to hire for a job and you've got like 2 or 3 different people. Like, yeah, you're going to make a lot more of a cost benefit calculation there. But maybe that doesn't make as much sense in the more kind of nebulous interpersonal relationships where it's more difficult to measure elements. So all good things about both persuasiveness and critiques here. Again, I want to challenge you to continue to think about what about these theories make sense? What are you pushing back against and why? And invite you to continue to explore that as we work through these theories in the class. So to wrap up for today, we talked a little bit about social exchange theory, this way of thinking about and looking at our human relationships. The way that it's making this calculation, we might consider it apt, or we might consider it strategic. And again, opening ourselves up to challenging and looking at the overall effectiveness of this theory. Next week, we will move on to social penetration theory, talking about self-disclosure, how we choose to open ourselves up to other people. Again, please complete that Google form that I linked through Canvas announcement, just to indicate your preferences and availability for presentation. Go ahead and either pass forward or email your activity for today with your group members' names on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Have a good weekend. And I will see you all again next Monday. Yeah.
Our presentation for the half, the ones that's on the list, or the one that